Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. If I could ask you to please find your seats. Good morning all. My name is Michael Bailey. I'm the CEO of the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this morning. We have a range of dignitaries in the audience, and in particular I'd like to welcome the Premier of Tasmania and Treasurer, Lara Giddings MP. There's probably no tougher job today in Tassie. We're doing the roadshow around the state. We start here this morning, go to Launceston next, and then finish in Burnie tonight, with the opportunity for business to connect, to ask questions direct, and to find out about our budget straight from the person that put it together. So welcome today. We have the Minister for Economic Development, David O'Byrne, the Minister for Finance, Scott Bacon, Leader of the Opposition, Mr Will Hodgman, Member for Denison, Elise Archer, Member for Franklin, Jackie Petrusma. We have the Member for Mersey here as well, Mike Gaffney, Member for Pembroke, Vanessa Goodwin, and a host of aldermen from a range of councils are here this morning too. Welcome to you all. We have the board members of the TCCI here this morning. We have our Chair, Andrew Heap, Polly Venning, Bill Aronson, Paul Arnold, Richard Laurie, and Damon Wells. Welcome to my board, and be very nice to them for me, please. Sponsor level members here today that help us to put these events together and to be a strong Chamber of Commerce. We have Hydro, represented by Lance Balcombe, Telstra by Michael Patterson, the Federal Group by Daniel Hanna, Forestry Tasmania by Steve Whiteley, and Port of Melbourne by Gary McCarthy. We also have sponsor level members that have helped with today's event too. So to Tasplan, Naomi, thank you so much for your support, and Damon Wise from Southern Cross Television, thank you again. And to you all, our terrific members, thank you so much for this morning. It's going to be a very exciting morning indeed. And it's fair to say it's been an interesting year for the TCCI since we last held this event. We've had to reduce costs, we've had to ensure that we're delivering what our members want us to deliver. And it's probably quite a similar story to all businesses around the state. This is a time to be efficient, a time to be focused, a time to relook at what our customers want and to be smart about how we do business. I'm pleased to say that the confidence is returning to the TCCI. Our membership, which has always been strong, is growing again, and business is reliant on us, particularly through our programs of industrial relations, OH&S, training and so forth. And I really do look forward today to hearing what the government has done to do the same for their business. Today, I'll give you a rundown of what's happening. You'll hear from our Chief Economist, Phil Bailey, who'll talk about the state of the economy, where we're sitting. We'll then hear from the Premier Treasurer about her budget. And then it's across to you to ask questions of the Premier and the Treasurer, to ask what this budget's about and what it means to you and your business. I have 3 questions that we put out to our Facebook followers to ask direct to the Premier to get us all going this morning too. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting day. It gives me great pleasure now though to welcome the Chair of the TCCI to the stage, Mr Andrew Heap.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It seems like yesterday that I stood up here last year and spoke to you. I'm Andrew Heap, I'm Chair of the Board. Quite proud of the work we're doing at the TCCI this year. Got the paper this morning, got up early, went for a walk and looked at the front page. There were 2 things on the front page. One was the budget and the other one was the passing of a great Australian, Hazel Hawke, and I just wanted to pause for 2 or 3 seconds to recognise a great career, a great supporter of a great political leader. So I'll just pause there for a couple of seconds. The other big issue on the paper this morning, of course, was the budget, and that's what we're here for today. My job is to introduce Naomi Edwards, the Chair of Tasplan. We've always had a very close relationship. TCCI was fundamental in the start of Tasplan. So Naomi, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, Andrew. Tasplan's delighted to be a sponsor of this morning's budget briefing. Superannuation funds like Tasplan are kind of the quiet achievers of the Tasmanian economy. We're not as sexy as Mona, we're not as thrilling as Targa, but safe and secure is probably how you want your superannuation to be. Many people don't realise, but over the last 25 years, Tasplan has quietly amassed some $2 billion towards the retirement dreams of around 100,000 Tasmanians. It might seem odd that a super fund is sponsoring a state budget briefing because, of course, according to the experts, superannuation funds are awash with money and state governments really are. However, last night's budget and this morning's briefing are a very important backdrop to the work that Tasplan does. It's absolutely crucial for our members that we have a strong and thriving business community to provide them with lifelong employment until they reach a retirement with dignity. And because of our capacity to make significant investments in our local communities, it's also very important that we have a strong and creative government who's able to partner with us to come up with innovative infrastructure and investment opportunities, because superannuation funds have an enormous opportunity when they are locally based, such as Tasmania has, to make significant contributions to the growth and drive of our economy. And lastly, I just wanted to say that today is going to be a very exciting opportunity for government and business to have an open dialogue with each other about what we each need from each other to support each other. And again, super funds are a wonderful example of how business groups and union funds can sit together around a boardroom table and come up with fantastic strategies towards investment and growth. So therefore, Tasplan are delighted to be sponsoring this morning's breakfast, and we'd like to thank the TCCI for the work they do, not only in organising events like this, but also in supporting the 11,000 employee groups who have their member super with us, and all of the employers in Tasmania. So thank you very much.
Yeah, look, we really couldn't run these sorts of events without the help of our sponsors. Tasplan, thank you so much, Naomi, for your support. And look, it's just so key for any organisation to have a strong board. We're very lucky with the TCCI. Our board is new and engaged, and we have a terrific staff who are all working very hard too to continue to provide to our members. And many of them are here today. I won't single them out because they'll probably shoot me for that, but thank you again so much to my team for their support across not only the last few months, but also today. It's a very big day for us indeed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we clearly need some idea of what's happening in our economy, what's happening in Tasmania. So we have our Chief Economist, Phil Bailey, ready to present to you. Please feel free to drink. We'll have food service commencing at the time too. So drink up your coffees, enjoy the food, and welcome to the stage, please, Mr. Phil Bailey.
Good morning, everyone. It was back in December downstairs when I stood up and introduced the Premier to talk about the jobs plan and the revised estimates and mid-year financial report. At that stage, the economy was, I guess you could say, struggling. The word we've been using lately is anaemic, which we think it's that because anaemic really means lifeless and lacking vitality. So back in December, the government announced a jobs plan that introduced a range of measures to try to support the economy. They were largely temporary, targeted and timely, but without being extravagant. My view of this budget is that it pretty much builds on that. I'll come to the budget in a minute, but just to look at the economic context of this budget, that's my job this morning. So what I'm not going to do is deliver a very heavy economic treatise. It's far too early for that. So just looking at the national economy, these are the numbers straight out of last week's Commonwealth budget. What you can see here is probably a story of the national economy being somewhat below its long-term potential, with GDP growth in the range of around 3% per year. Now, that probably there's an underlying message here, and you all would have heard it with the transition from the current stage of the mining boom, the RBA and the federal government are very conscious that that is unwinding the current capital expenditure phase, and the replacement is in the non-mining states trying to pick those up at the same time as the capex boom unwinds. The RBA is very conscious of that and probably a little bit concerned that that transition isn't happening quick enough, and that is really the message of its recent rate cut and potentially more rate cuts to come. You can see there with employment, it's also quite sluggish across the whole economy, so only talking 1.25–1.5% going forward in terms of employment growth, which means that there's no real prospects of a declining unemployment rate, CPI in the middle of the RBA's target band. So it is ticking along. It's not going not going gangbusters by any means, and that reflects the macroeconomic settings at the moment. There's clearly a challenge for the federal government. Underlying cash balance, very significant surplus there of $43 billion expected this financial year. And they're not expecting to be returned to a balanced position until about 2015-16 and a relatively modest surplus in 2016-17. Now, that's actually a pattern that we'll come to in a minute in terms of what the state looks like. But that is a reasonably significant surplus. We all know that. Now, the federal government's been portraying that as largely a decline in its forecast revenues across most of its tax bases, including a shortfall in the minerals tax. But the other factor here is the federal government has been talking about its spending restraints. One of the issues that's quite clear in the budget is while there's been some dilution of the spending pressures, going forward they're still expecting to be spending, apart from the current financial year, more and more each year. And so what you're looking at there is spending growth of between 4 and 6% over the forward estimates period. That's still pretty strong spending growth. That's more than CPI. That means more public servants employed by the Commonwealth. Of course, we hope plenty of them are employed here. But in terms of the fiscal balance, or fiscal situation, there is still an issue with the federal government continuing to spend. And that's reflected in the forecast deficits. So as we turn to Tasmania, what we have is we all know that there are structural challenges. So what we see the role of the government is to actually facilitate that private sector growth and facilitate that structural change. Where the focus needs to be, and most of you would have heard of these, the three long-term drivers of long-term economic growth are population, participation and productivity. A key part of those is actually addressing the issues of Tasmania's long-term human capital. We have issues in skill and education. We have issues in the health system. We all know that. But we as a chamber believe that a key part of addressing those is actually with migration. So skilled migration, putting enough resources into that, enough effort, but also, as we know, the humanitarian entrants that are arriving not just in Australia but in Tasmania, out at Pontville, but even when they're released, keeping them here in Tasmania contributes to the long-term change of the Tasmanian population and hopefully can make a long-term difference to Tasmania in future generations. So obviously in that context, the state government cannot drive the change itself. It can facilitate the change, but by spending money, it's not going to deliver, by spending excessive amounts of money, it's not going to deliver that structural change in its own right. So it needs to make sure the state budget is sustainable. Obviously that involves reducing spending in areas that don't contribute to long-term outcomes, holding and hopefully reducing the existing tax base, but also looking for opportunities for long-term tax reform. Now this is probably as complex as I'll get this morning. This is a picture of the Tasmanian economy. Some of you would have seen this in the past, but what it's really saying is that there are no single sectors in the Tasmanian economy that can really drive, in their own right, a turnaround in the Tasmanian economy. So what you have is, it's probably understated the extent to which the Tasmanian economy is actually very diverse. You have a large manufacturing sector, you have a large retail sector, you have a large accommodation and food sector, which obviously involves a large degree of tourism. But what we can't do is ignore the old economy during the transition to the new economy. What we actually need is support across the board for the private sector, across all sectors, to help them to grow. So, looking at more of a short-term picture, what we're hearing at the moment from members and other businesses as we travel around is some signs of improving confidence. So that's both the anecdotal evidence, but our most recent survey of business expectations, which was released 2 and a bit weeks ago, actually pointed to some small signs of improving business confidence. That's in the actual numbers. Now, I'm not quite clearly looking at the chart, and that's the yellow line on the bottom. Business confidence is at record low levels, or has been at record low levels. You cannot ignore that equation. But what you can see in the last couple of quarters is some small signs of improvement. And one of the pleasing things about this improvement is that it's actually not riding off the coattails of the national economy. That gap to confidence from Tasmanian business in the national economy is closing. So that means that those businesses are actually seeing signs of improvement on the ground here in Tasmania. But just to reiterate, we need to remember that this is very early signs. Some of the other numbers are starting to turn around, such as the retail numbers, but confidence has been off such a low level for quite a prolonged period that we certainly can't call a turnaround in the Tasmanian economy at this stage yet. Now, clearly what we want is strong growth in the private sector. And one of the challenges is ensuring that the capital expenditure profile going forward can be sustained. Some of the early signs probably aren't there yet, certainly not in the housing market, and business investment probably isn't as strong as it could be, and that has been sustaining the economy in the past couple of years. But one of the challenges is, again, the sustainability of the budget position. When you look at this chart, what that's really saying is that that solid line on there is actually state final demand. So that's quarter on the previous corresponding period. So that's over 4 quarters, what the growth has been. You can see there a steady decline over the past couple of years, and that's demand in Tasmania. So that's spending by consumers, by businesses, and by government, essentially. So you can see there that the Tasmanian economy, this is really evidence that the Tasmanian economy has been anaemic and deteriorating for a couple of years. But part of what's actually propping up the economy is government spending. And so the solid columns are actually the contributions. In the purple part of the column is the state and local sector, and the yellow part is the federal government. So what that's really saying is that governments have actually been contributing more and more to the Tasmanian economy. We just need to be conscious of that while there are significant budget challenges. And so the challenge for the budget, as I see it, and the Premier will talk about this in a moment, but obviously we have economic conditions where conditions have been anaemic, and as a result, economic growth and other key indicators have been weaker than expected. That's obviously flowing through to a significant deterioration in the revenue position, and as a result, the 2012-13 net operating deficit, which is the key measure of the budget and the outcome, is estimated to be a deficit of $426 million in the current financial year. Now that we all know that that's a lot worse. That's what's splashed over the front page of the papers, no doubt. I haven't even seen the papers yet. So we all know that's a fact. The question is, how quickly that can turn around from here. And one of the challenges is, same as it was for the federal government, that there is no surplus forecast until around 2016-17. So in that context, we certainly support the government's initiative to increase the threshold for payroll tax exemptions from 1.01 to 1.25 million. That will help businesses, and businesses are always telling us that payroll tax is a disincentive to employment, particularly new employment, and particularly as the economy starts to tick up. So we certainly support that initiative at the same time as there are significant budget challenges. And that is, of course, the first change in 10 years in that payroll tax exemption. The other issue is the spending restraint, and we've commended the government for its efforts since the 2010-11 mid-year financial report, so that was, I think it was February 2011, to actually bring some discipline to the budget. And there have been significant reductions in the pace of spending growth, which was clearly unsustainable. So we commend the government for that. The only concern we've got with this budget is really that there's a little bit of creep in there relative to the revised estimates, and that is part of what's contributing to that surplus. But certainly there is a significant revenue issue, and that is across the bases. That's GST, that's own state tax revenue, and it's also contributions from the government businesses, particularly one down here, Hydro Tasmania, and again that reflects some policy changes, the federal government, of which the state has no control, of course. So that's where I'll leave it. I'll like to hand over to the Premier, the Honourable Lara Giddings MP, to really talk about how she sees the budget outlook, but also the economic profile of the state, and I'm sure the Premier will touch on some of the structural changes that I've also touched on, and how that's relaying through state government policy.
Well, good morning everyone, and what a wonderful turnout for the budget breakfast this year, and thank you to TasPlan for your sponsorship of this event, and also to the TCCI for organising the events across the state. We've certainly got a long day ahead of us, but a great day. Every year that I've done the roadshow, I've been very interested to hear the questions and discussion after my presentation, and to hear what the issues are at the forefront of your minds, and to see how they differ as you move around the state as well, because I certainly think that the impact of the global financial crisis, the impact of falling revenues, the impact on business confidence certainly differs across the regions. And thank you, Phil, for your presentation then as well. This, as I said, is the third time that I've been able to address this important post-budget event, to provide an opportunity for us as a state government to be able to tell you about what is in the government and how we intend to work with the business community. My first address 3 years ago was a sobering experience when we were really suffering from that global financial crisis and the dramatic decrease in revenue. At that time, we had a $1.5 billion revenue loss, which then became a $1.8 billion revenue loss. And as a result of that, some strong decisions were required to be made. So the first presentation I made to you was all about those cuts that had to be made across the state government agencies and the budget. My second presentation, a year later, was in a climate of softening economic conditions further, which required us to implement even further savings measures to deal with that revenue problem. Unfortunately, this still remains a problem for us in terms of revenue. As you will see today, the revenue situation continues to underwhelm, and we continue to have to exercise financial discipline. What has changed, though, is that strong expenditure control has enabled us to invest in significant long-term reforms for the benefit of our state and future generations. For instance, Tasmania will be a full participant in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And we've also set aside funds so that we can be part of the national Gonski education reforms to deliver record levels of funding that will be going into our schools and supporting our students. I'm also particularly pleased that on this occasion I can address the business community to talk about providing major and permanent relief in the area of payroll tax. I think for every year that I have been a Member of Parliament, that has been one of the first issues that the TCCI has raised with the government of the day. I'll focus the first part of my presentation on the outlook for our state finances. I'll then move on to look at the broader economy, which remains under pressure, but is undoubtedly showing a healthier outlook. As most of you would now be familiar, Tasmania's recent financial challenges have largely emerged due to the unprecedented and continued downturn in GST collections nationally, which are the product of a more cautious consumer. If you look at the chart, you can see that since the emergence of the global financial crisis in 2007, we have seen GST receipts remain flat. We are now starting to see some recovery in GST, largely due to our improved relativity. In other words, our share of the national GST pool. We know our share will improve due to revenue growth in other states from the mining boom and also the cessation of federal stimulus funding and the Royal Hobart Hospital upgrade payments to Tasmania. Nevertheless, as the chart shows, we are still some $40 million worse off per annum than anticipated just 12 months ago. We've seen a similar decline in state taxation receipts, which are now down some $64 million per annum on average. The main driver of this has been lower levels of activity in the property market, leading to a decline in stamp duty. Returns from our state's electricity businesses have also been revised down by about $68 million per annum on average. The main contributing factors to this are falling demand in the national electricity market. And an example of that, of course, is the tragedy of the Ford Motor Company closing their operations in Victoria. Another example of a big business in manufacturing in Victoria that will no longer be purchasing energy off the grid. This is impacting on Tasmania. It's also due to a reduction in the carbon price assumption following the change in the Commonwealth's policy around their carbon floor price. These revenue declines, combined with major unforeseeable expenditure items like the $45 million cost of the January bushfires, have caused us to delay reaching some of our fiscal targets. Our return to surplus and elimination of net debt will be delayed until 2016-17. However, we will achieve this without imposing new savings targets on government services and no new taxes or increases in existing taxes. And it's great to see the headlines of the TCCI business reporter there saying that we could hardly afford any tax increases. So we've listened to you. To cut harder and faster or to increase the tax burden at this time would risk setting back the recovery we are seeing in our economy and in the state's finances. And before I move off this slide, I'll just quickly tackle the notion that this is Tasmania's biggest ever deficit. On any reasonable measure, this is not even close to the biggest budget deficit in Tasmania's history. In the early 1990s, we saw deficits that were as big as 10% of total expenses. The latest estimates show the deficit this year will not even be half of that level. So yes, in raw terms, it may look big. In real terms, it's nowhere near the problems that we faced in the 1990s and particularly in 1998 when we came into government with a $1.6 billion net debt problem. And to say otherwise, I think, is damaging and does nothing to try to help boost business confidence at a time when it's still relatively fragile. When it comes to debt, our net debt levels remain very low by historical standards. And had we listened to those who urged us not to reduce our spending back in 2011, and they were there, believe you me, Tasmania would be heading for net debt of around $4 billion and interest rates having to be paid in the order of some $300 million per annum, which would have meant more massive cuts. In fact, we would have had to have gone far deeper into our public service in relation to dealing with a problem of that nature. Instead, net debt will peak in 2015 at $229 million, which is the equivalent of around $440 per head of population here in Tasmania. Our nearest neighbour is Victoria, and to give you a comparison in relation to that, they have over $4,000 per head of population problem in Victoria. That is the sort of problem we in fact inherited in 1998, when at that time here in Tasmania it was roughly $4,000 per head of population. So that puts that figure very much into perspective. $440 is manageable and we have a pathway out. We're also continuing our strong investment in infrastructure that will support future economic growth and provide better services for Tasmanians. Over the next 4 years, our infrastructure investment will exceed $1.4 billion, with the majority earmarked for roads, health and for education. Our government businesses will also invest a further $2.3 billion into critical economic infrastructure like our rail and our ports. While much budget commentary has focused on the size of the deficit and the suggestion that this has been driven by high levels of government spending, this analysis is simply not accurate. As this chart shows, we've come from a period of what would now be considered very high revenue growth. Accordingly, expenditure outlays were set at similarly high levels. However, from 2010, this financial landscape shifted dramatically. Revenues not only slowed, but began to decline in real terms for the first time in a generation. This required immediate action to deliver expenditure restraint. And in 2011-12, we reined in expenditure growth to just 1.8%, and we have managed to continue this modest spending growth right across the forward estimates, a level of fiscal consolidation that is unparalleled across the rest of the nation. I'll now turn to Tasmania's economic outlook. Tasmania's economy continues to be structurally affected by the immense forces of an unprecedented mining boom, terms of trade and associated high exchange rate. The structure of our economy, with a heavier reliance on manufacturing, tourism and traditional agriculture, means we feel these pressures harder than most. And this slide shows the State Treasury's analysis and outlook for the Tasmanian economy. But people in this room don't need a Treasury analysis to tell you that the last 12 months have been tough. And I'm first person to acknowledge that conditions have not been easy. But we have a choice about analysing what our economy has done, or we can look forward to what our economy can do. And I'm pleased to say that the economic outlook is improving. As the chart shows, we expect next year to deliver gross state product of 2%, 1,400 new jobs, lower unemployment and further population growth. These are not my forecasts, these are the forecasts of the State Treasury, which has never been known for economic exuberance. While Treasury is responsible for the forecasts, the government is responsible for the broad economic settings. And I'm proud to stand here today and talk about a budget that has the economic levers set towards growth and jobs. The centrepiece of our growth strategy in this budget is a major shift in the payroll tax exemption threshold. For the first time since the year 2000, we are delivering real and permanent payroll tax relief by increasing the exemption threshold from that 1.01 million to 1.25 million from the 1st of July this year. This will keep money out of the State Tax Office and in the hands of more than 2,250 businesses next year and every year forever more. In fact, around 130 businesses will no longer pay payroll tax at all. It comes at a cost of around $40 million over the forward estimates. But I have listened to the Tasmanian business leaders and their representative bodies like the TCCI, and I know that this money is well spent. As the chart shows, Tasmania now has the most generous payroll tax exemption of any state in Australia. We are serious about providing a competitive taxation environment, and this is a clear signal to the nation that Tasmania is open for business. I'm pleased to see the recent TCCI confidence survey show signs of a recovery in business confidence. Yes, as Phil pointed out, confidence is still low, but it is finally heading in the right direction. And this backs up recent data showing a clear improvement in consumer confidence. Since the onset of the global financial crisis, we have seen households around the nation take sensible decisions to pay down debt and build their savings. This phenomena can be seen by the sharp upturn in the household savings ratio shown in the chart on the right-hand side of this slide. Australian households have moved a situation of negative savings in the early 2000s to a generational high savings ratio within the space of just a few years. And this partly explains a sharp drop-off in GST receipts. But more importantly, from this strong base, households are now beginning to rebuild confidence to spend. This is backed up by strong growth in retail trade and also in new car sales. Now, while population growth has clearly slowed, unlike the 1990s, it still remains in positive territory. Undoubtedly, the strength of the mining boom has pulled workers out of Tasmania. But over the longer term, as the mining boom recedes, there is every reason to believe that Tasmania will become a destination of choice. We are in the right part of the world at the right time. We have unique natural assets and unrivalled livability advantages. And while I'm on this subject, I want to take the opportunity to state clearly for the record that I support maximising the economic opportunities of Tasmania's natural resources. Tomorrow, indeed, I'll be in Tulla to tell the West Coast community that the government backs the mining industry. And as much as our political opponents like to suggest otherwise, it is an undeniable fact that under this government, we have seen record levels of growth in mining employment and record levels of mining exploration. It is because of the strength of sectors like mining, along with agriculture, dairy, aquaculture and specialist manufacturing, that we do anticipate a turnaround in employment. Over the forward estimates, Treasury has forecast the creation of an additional 9,000 jobs, with the unemployment rate set to drop back below 7%. We know that with several large construction projects, along with major infrastructure rollouts like irrigation and the National Broadband Network, that these forecasts are achievable. And while we're on the topic of employment, I would like to just temper the current heated political debate with some economic history. As this slide clearly demonstrates, by historical standards, Tasmania's labour market is a long way from the depressing situation we faced in the 1990s. This was a time when we barely had 400 out of every 1,000 Tasmanians employed and faced unemployment rates as high as 13%. Unemployment in Tasmania today is still too high, but we also need to know where we've come from and recognise the resilience that we have built into our economy today. Ultimately, though, what this budget is all about is jobs, people and opportunities, and I've mentioned our investment in the NDIS and Gonski education reforms. But let me conclude on my number one priority, which is jobs. So what does this budget deliver for jobs? It delivers the first payroll tax cut in 13 years, a payroll tax rebate for new jobs, a boost for residential construction with the $15,000 first home builders boost, another round of the Tasmanian Government Innovation and Investment Fund, which has already delivered around 470 jobs, more funding for tourism marketing and tourism attractions, $3.7 billion in infrastructure across government and our government business enterprises, $40 million for new irrigation schemes as part of our $400 million investment in irrigation, and extra support for Tasmanian irrigation to attract new investment. And most importantly, tapping into the biggest jobs engine in the world through maximising Tasmania's place in the Asian century. But ultimately, the job creators of Tasmania are not us, the politicians. The real job creators are the hard-working businessmen and women in this room and outside of it, and many more who can't afford time to be here this morning. And I hope that from this budget, you can feel confident to continue investing in our great state and creating job opportunities in Tasmania. Thank you.
Again, please join me in thanking the Premier and Treasurer of Tasmania, Lara Giddings, for her presentation this morning. As I said before, we put questions out to our membership across our Facebook and social media sites, asking for questions to get the questions going this morning. I should say, in a little while, there will be roving mics going through the audience, so put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. But we wanted to ask 3 questions to get the ball rolling. We had a fantastic response, so we've tried to grab questions that are diverse and across the economy. The first one's a bit of a lengthy one, so Premier, feel free to grab a glass of water and to prepare yourself. It says, Dr. Bruce Filmingham recently released a report looking at the contribution to the Tasmanian economy of the state's major industries. In the report, the author identified 5 employers alone contribute $1 billion, and the broader group contributes $2.5 billion, or 11% of Tasmania's gross state product. This group directly employs in excess of 3,000 Tasmanians and accounts for 49% of the total export revenue of the state. The study centred on Grange Resources, MMG Mining and Bell Bay Aluminium in the north, and Nearstar and North Skeg in the south. All of these state wealth creators require higher volumes of affordable electricity. Electricity transmission costs have risen in excess of 200% in the last 5 years, against a backdrop of global financial turmoil, which arguably means electricity in Tasmania is fast becoming unaffordable. As it stands, the state government has announced $8 million in savings to come from the merger of Transend and Aurora, which seems to be such an insignificant sum compared to the skyrocketing increases in transmission charges. These market reforms should be implemented to deliver a significant cost reduction that will be substantial for every Tasmanian and every Tasmanian business. The question is, what specifically will the state government do to ensure that future transmission pricing in the state is more affordable so that critical industry can remain viable and internationally competitive, and also to attract new businesses?
Thank you very much for that question. And may I start by saying that our 5 major industrials are very important to Tasmania and to our economy, and it's one of the reasons why we've worked closely with all 5 of those major industrials to ensure that what support government can provide through some very tough economic environments, particularly with the high Australian dollar hitting exporters as it does. And we have, with a number of those, worked with them around the cost of energy as well. And of course, those negotiations are confidential between Hydro Tasmania and the businesses involved. But we have certainly been working very hard to try to keep that downward pressure on energy prices as one way of helping to alleviate some of the stress that these major industrials have had. And we've also been working closely with the Australian government to see what level of investment can be provided that can help these companies also build in further efficiencies that make it more attractive to stay here in Tasmania. So that's we do believe that they are an important backbone to the Tasmanian economy, and we have prioritised them for that reason as well. In terms of wider energy reform, we're going through some historical energy reforms right now, and it's all been driven to keep the downward pressure on energy prices at all levels, from the large industrials through to the mums and dads as well. In fact, the sale of Aurora and opening up to full retail contestability will be part of the major achievements of our reforms, which I believe begin next year in relation to FRC. So around transmission costs specifically, we have been working very closely with Transend, and the board and the company have understood the need to try to keep transmission costs down. They have a very small investment projection around further transmission infrastructure. They did have to build the Watamana to Lindisfarne transmission lines, which were expensive, but that cost, a necessary cost, has now gone through the system. And they are now keeping their pressure right down on further expenditure. There will always have to be some capital maintenance upgrades that occur, as you would expect. And we, I believe, will see that reflected in the cost of electricity to everybody as the independent economic regulator comes forward with that price. So exactly what that will be, we don't know, but we believe it will be very manageable for business and for the mums and dads as well.
Question number 2 is, Premier, the budget has 58 spending announcements, yet only one saving announcement. How does this reflect a responsible budget?
Well, I think what that question forgets is the fact that when I brought out the mid-year financial report in 2010-11, followed up by the 2011-12 budget, we set a very strong savings agenda across government. And in fact, we have been delivering on that savings agenda. Just to remind you, in 2010-11, our mid-year financial report savings were $160 million. And the 11-12 budget had a state wages policy saving of around $50 million recurrent, agency savings of $240 million recurrent, along with state tax measures and stronger GBE returns assisting us at that point. In total, these actions built in recurrent savings in excess of $300 million per annum. Now, we had to follow that up last year in the 2012-13 budget with additional savings targets across all agencies other than health, education and police who were quarantined. Now, those additional savings targets were an extra $20 million from government agencies. So I believe that you have to look at this budget within the plan that we set back in that 2010-11 mid-year financial report. It was a tough plan, but it was one that I stood here at that time and said I'm determined to deliver on it, and that's what we are continuing to deliver now. And because we took those strong decisions in that year 11 and 12 budget particularly, that has built in the resilience that we're seeing today in the budget, where we can withstand another $300 million hit on our revenues and not have to make dramatic decisions to deal with that. So in that respect, I do commend our government agencies for the hard work they've put into finding those savings, and I think what we've delivered as a budget is a responsible budget that really does strike that balance between ensuring that you don't go overboard with starting to spend too much and being profligate in that respect, but not cutting further, and by doing so engendering this fear in people that they will lose their jobs and therefore stop spending, and engender that slowing confidence again in the business community as they wonder what's going to happen next. So I personally believe this is a good budget. It does strike the right balance, and it's one that will give us that build on that foundation we've already set, that will see us come out of net debt back into surplus as well, and give all of us the confidence that we're looking for.
Before I ask the last question, on the right-hand side we have Kristen, one of our team members. Left-hand side we have Colleen, one of our team members, with mobile microphones ready to go. So perhaps if you start putting your hands up now. The intention today was to provide as much time for the businesses of Tasmania, the business leaders of Tasmania, all the wonderful members in the room to ask questions direct. So I'll ask the last question, which is there a better time for a government to look at real structural change than when a budget is in such crisis? Why is real structural change off the agenda, particularly regarding to education and health?
Well, I would say that real structural change has not been off the agenda and it has been continuing. We haven't had forced closure of schools, but we have still, by working with local communities, seen changes and some schools indeed close. Others, like Geeveston High School, for instance, the high school has closed, but the primary school continues. Structural change is occurring. But what you were shown in that period after the 11-12 budget is if you don't bring the community with you, you can't achieve effective change. And I will note that at the time those decisions were made, there were very few voices out there standing up for government at that time saying, yes, you're doing the right thing. If you don't have that support, it's very difficult to drive structural change in that way through that sort of method. But you don't give up. When you know you need structural change, you find other methods to achieve it. And I do commend the Education Department on the work they are doing in local communities, in working with parents and friends, in working with school councils to say, how can we improve the education outcomes for your children? What better learning environment can we provide them? And as I said in the example of my own electorate, with Geeveston High School, that community was able to say it would be better for our kids to travel to Huonville than to keep struggling to try to provide the education, teaching standards and opportunities to our kids in Geeveston. So I expect we'll see more of that sort of conversation happening around the state. But I also want to just make a point here too, that while you talk about the bricks and mortar, we've also got change happening around us with the NBN and how you're able to provide services to rural and regional communities. And we have to factor this thinking in as well. How can we, in fact, provide further schooling to kids in their rural communities rather than expecting them to travel hours on buses to get to colleges, for instance? So part of what we're driving the change here is looking at how you can use the NBN to deliver classes in rural areas. How can you deliver further subjects in rural areas as well? But still, there may well be a need for some to travel in order to get some specialised help. But we're definitely looking at how you can deal with that as a new innovative source of teaching.
Right, now over to you, the businesses of Tasmania. If I could ask you to raise your hand, one of our people will scoot across with a microphone. I can see some questions already. If I can just have you stand. It's really hard for us to see you from up here unless you do stand up. And I know the Premier's keen to talk to you direct. So if, we have a first question. Premier,
Amanda Quealy from the Hobart Clinic and President of the Tasmanian Private Hospital Association. 40% of Tasmanians hold private health insurance and they've made a commitment to contribute to the cost of their health care. In terms of the structural changes within health, there's a real opportunity for the government within such a small resource environment where we've got a shortage of health professionals and an increasing demand for care and an ageing population to have some public-private partnerships, and yet that remains very difficult to get on the agenda.
I think, Amanda, you might have raised similar issues in the past as well, and I think that these conversations are very important to have in terms of how we can build the relationship with the private sector in health. I was very interested just last week to see the Prime Minister in town again talking about the benefits of NBN, in that case talking about the benefits of e-health, and beaming in from other parts of Australia specialists into the surgeries of GPs and others here in Tasmania. And I think that through that sort of partnership we will see a lot more occurring where we get access to specialists who otherwise don't live and work in Tasmania but are able to help us to support our patients. The conversations between the private sector and the public sector are important. They do happen. We do work with the private sector around elective surgery. We've certainly done that in my time as Health Minister, and I believe that that still happens today as well. We ultimately want to get outcomes for patients, but what sounds simple can always be a little more complex when you try to bring about the practical realities, but there is no ideological reason why we wouldn't support and work with the private sector. They play an important role in our healthcare system.
Robert Wallace of Quality Consultants Proprietary Limited. Treasurer, we all know that healthy, strong communities come from strong private sector growth and jobs. currently there is a slight trend up in investment confidence in the state. I just ask the question, and I'll preempt it in so much as the last 5 or 6 years there's been regional planning schemes trying to be put into place to help reduce and fast track, but under close scrutiny, fast track projects, building projects and other investment. What's your government doing to finalise those planning schemes and to put in place systems where businesses and investors can look at this state and say, yes, we know that project will be finished on time?
Planning reform has been a huge part of our agenda over the past 3 years, and in fact it was the number one issue that the business community was telling us that we needed to focus our attention on, and that's exactly what we have been doing. We've put additional resources into planning over the last 3 years. In fact, at a time when we were cutting everything in 11-12, planning was virtually the only area of government to get additional resources. In this budget, we're putting further additional resources into planning, around $500,000, which is aimed to help generate some further action behind the work that the Minister is doing. Now, we have had results in that time. We do now have a single planning template for the whole state. We've got the new code for residential development, which is cutting costs and is also helping to speed up the approval process. And we've got new regional land use strategies as well. There is further work that is happening around that planning issue, and we're seeing the changes occurring, and believe you me, we all want to see it happen. It does take time to work through, and sometimes frustratingly, but it is happening, and with those additional resources in this year's budget we expect to see further speeding up of that process. Is that all? Yeah. No more questions, you're all too shy. Bob Gozzi. Yeah.
Microphone's coming.
Premier, I promised myself not to ask a question. I can't help myself. As an advocate for reduction in payroll tax over the last 10 years or so, really pleased that you've picked that up, and it's going to make a real difference. We've been banging on about that, as you rightly say, for about the last 10 years or so, or probably longer. I remember pre-budget submissions back in the 90s and even before then. I noted in your budget that one of the premises, one of the planks underpinning the budget is the continuing mining boom and the revenues from that. As it happened, I read yesterday that in China manufacturing is declining, and has declined for the first time for a long time. Have you thought about that in terms of what you might do if that revenue doesn't materialise?
Well, we see that there is confidence in the mining sector in Tasmania, in investment. I guess in a sense we've not got a big enough resource in order to have had the big high that Western Australia and Queensland, and even indeed the Northern Territory, have experienced with the mining boom. And in some respects that's probably a good thing for us, because if there is a slowing, we don't have a major fall. We actually do have a budget that can build and has built in that fluctuation of revenues that's a lot more consistent. And as I said, the $300 million that we are having to deal with across this budget is manageable, far more manageable than the $1.8 billion that we had to deal with in 2010-11 mid-year financial report. So we still have active interest. We have investors here. Now, they're the ones who will tell you whether or not there's a future market for their product in that respect. And we have a process of Shree Minerals, for instance, going through a planning process. Unfortunately, there is a federal court aspect to that at this point in time, but I'm confident that that will go ahead. Venture, of course, have got a number of interests on the northwest coast in that Tarkine area as well, of which we're looking at mining less than 1% of that whole region, just to put it in context when you hear that debate in the public arena. So I believe that with that interest that is there, there is a market there for what we've got. And we know we have around $11 billion worth of assets sitting in the ground, and there's a huge opportunity for us to realise the wealth of those assets. Okay. One last question from anybody? Yes.
Tracy Matthews. I'm a director of TasPlan and also of Colony 47. I noticed that one of the strong drivers of a strong economy is the participation rate. Is there anything in this budget specifically to address that within the community sector and also to increase participation?
Well, certainly, we want Tasmanians to be employed, and we accept that the community sector have a very important role to play in relation to supporting those people, some whom are long-term unemployed as well. And one of the best supports that I've seen on the ground has in fact been through our neighbourhood and community houses. It's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about them, because I've seen lives literally turned around. And I would add to that now the Men's Shed program as well has been an opportunity for men to engage in that sort of social interaction, which is where you can then start to work with people and build up the self-esteem and encourage them to take on training opportunities that are around, encourage them to apply for jobs. And I have seen those stories, and it's fantastic when you see it happen. So with neighbourhood houses, we, in last year's budget, put additional dollars into them on a recurrent basis to help strengthen them within those communities. They are in about 33 communities across the state. And in this, in the jobs package, as both a stimulus for the construction area with jobs, but also to help strengthen the infrastructure of those neighbourhood houses, we put additional funds in, and we've backed that up now with further funding in this budget as well that will see further extensions to their housing premises and the ability for them to be able to strengthen the programs that they deliver. And of course, for the non-government sector, we've also helped them through the equal remuneration order to assist them in actually being able to provide better wages and equal wages in that sector as is experienced across the government sector, and more reflective of other sectors in that respect. So we're pleased to be able to support the NGO sector too. This budget is very firmly around our government's agenda. It can sound trite when you say 3 words of jobs, people and opportunities, but I can tell you under those 3 words there's a lot of work going on. And jobs is our number one priority, because we know ultimately that's what will help people deal with cost of living pressures that they may be experiencing. That's what will help them in terms of their health and well-being, self-esteem, all of those sorts of issues as well. And that's what will also get them away from having to be so dependent on some of the emergency relief and other support services the NGO sector provide. So that is unashamedly our number one priority, but we back that up with important investments like Gonski, like NDIS, like the ERO, those sorts of investments too. And of course, looking at the opportunities element is really about our children's future. What are we going to provide for them here in Tasmania? How are we going to keep them here? How are we going to ensure that they are job ready for the jobs of the future? Jobs that I can't even tell you about because we haven't even imagined them as yet. That's how quickly things are changing. And if you saw the slide of Phil Bailey's there about where the growth is in various sectors, it's not in manufacturing, it's not in that sort of work, it's actually in the service industries, it's using technology like the NBN, and you'll never hear me stop talking about that. And I can tell you the last thing we need is copper wire NBN. So if you've got any influence on anybody, if there is a change of government, make sure that you stand up for Tasmania and say we need the optic fibre to the door rolled out everywhere. It is critical to our future. Thank you very much.
Well, we've heard it direct from the Premier and Treasurer this morning, and I must say that I think as a business community we're very fortunate to have this opportunity the day after the budget to hear direct from the Premier about the package. Also, Richard Dowling, sorry that you had to stay up most of last night preparing the presentations this morning, but again, thank you so much. It's been a terrific morning. Thank you again to our members for your terrific support of these events, not only here but of course in Launceston and Burnie later tonight. The rollout of members shows the engagement of Tasmanian business in the Tasmanian economy. This morning, TasPlan Super have made this happen this morning. Thank you again, Naomi, so much for the support of TasPlan Super and the board. Also to Southern Cross Television or Southern Cross Media, thank you Damon and the crew. Your support always is very, very well appreciated. I'd like to also thank Rest Point, Mike Davey and the crew. I think you've done a terrific job this morning for us as always. Thank you again very much. And to finish off, we actually have a lucky door prize. We've got a terrific bottle of Stefano Lubiano wine to give away. So if I could ask one of my crew to come up with the draw, and I might ask Naomi if you can come back up onto the stage to do the draw for us, that would be terrific. And Colleen dashing up the side there.
And the winner is Ralph Desdens from Star Tasmania.
Congratulations, Ralph. You can collect your bottle of wine from Colleen. So well done. Again, thank you all so much for this morning. It's going to be a very exciting day. There's a lot of media happening. I know the Premier has Leon Compton next. Please enjoy your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon for the next TCCI function. Thank you all very much.